Hey, buddy, couldn't get a better job than pushing buttons on a ski lift? Or is this like the peak of achievement for someone like you? Blake Morrison's voice carried across the loading platform at Vail Mountain Resort, his expensive Oakley sunglasses reflecting the morning sun as he smirked at the Latino lift operator checking his ski pass. I mean, I'm just curious, do you actually need any brain cells for this job? Or do they just hire anyone who can count to 10 in English? What Blake didn't know, what this arrogant Canadian real estate developer was too busy being xenophobic to notice, was that the stupid lift operator he'd been mocking every morning for a week was actually Dr. Carlos Mendoza, one of Colombia's most renowned orthopedic spine surgeons who operated on Olympic athletes and professional soccer players before fleeing Medellin after drug cartels threatened to murder his family when he refused to provide illegal medical treatment to wounded cartel members. And what Blake definitely didn't realize was that in approximately 4 hours, his own reckless skiing would result in a catastrophic spinal fracture. A blizzard would prevent ambulances from reaching him. And the only thing standing between him and permanent paralysis in a wheelchair would be the brain-dead lift operator, whose orthopedic expertise far exceeded any American spine surgeon Blake could afford. Bro, you see, I was actually at Vail that week for my annual ski vacation something I'd been doing for 20 years since my security consulting business gave me flexibility to take time off during Colorado's peak season. I'd noticed Blake immediately because guys like him are impossible to miss, loud, entitled, treating service workers like they're scenery rather than humans. And I'd noticed Carlos too, because after 4 decades watching how people carry themselves, you develop instinct for recognizing when someone's current job doesn't match their actual capabilities. The way Carlos assessed skiers getting on the lift reminded me of doctors I'd worked with. That constant evaluation. Looking for problems before they happened, maintaining awareness that went beyond just loading people onto chairs, you know? Before I tell you how Blake's spine injury revealed that the stupid immigrant he'd been tormenting was actually more qualified to handle spinal trauma than most American orthopedic surgeons. Let me ask you something that probably resonates with folks who've witnessed workplace discrimination. Have you seen immigrants with professional backgrounds being mocked by people who assume their current job reflects their intelligence or education? Drop your city and country in the comments and share stories about qualified professionals you've met doing survival work while facing contempt from entitled customers who have no idea, who they actually dismissing because what happened on that Colorado mountain is gonna show you exactly why assumptions about. People based on their current uniform can literally determine whether you spend your life walking or in a wheelchair. And hey, before we get deep into Carlos' story, let me give a shout out to Patricia Gonzalez from Denver, Colorado, and Michael Kim from Vancouver, Canada, who've been consistently engaging with our videos. Patricia, your comment about your uncle who is a civil engineer in Mexico but works construction here really hit home for people. Michael, appreciate you sharing how your family physician in Korea ended up working as a medical translator in Canada. I'll keep those stories coming because they remind people that immigrants' current jobs often have zero correlation with their actual qualifications, bro. Now, if you'll pardon an old man for getting comfortable here at this ski lodge bar, where I am having my April ski beer, stories about refugee professionals forced into survival jobs while escaping violence always hit me particularly hard. At my age, having worked security in conflict zones, medical facilities, and everywhere humans face threats, I've met countless doctors, lawyers, engineers who fled their countries not because they wanted adventure, but because staying meant death for them or their families. Thank you for staying with Uncle Sam as I tell you about one of the most dramatic demonstrations I ever witnessed of why judging refugee immigrants by their current circumstances ignores the expertise and courage they bring despite impossible obstacles. To understand how Dr. Carlos Mendoza ended up operating ski lifts in Colorado despite being one of Latin America's most skilled orthopedic spine surgeons, we got to go back about 12 years to when his life in Medellin became untenable, and staying in Colombia meant either becoming complicit with drug cartels or watching his family get murdered. Carlos had been born in Medellin in 1982, growing up during the height of Pablo Escobar's reign when the city was the murder capital of the world. His father had been a pharmacist, his mother a teacher, and both had instilled in Carlos the belief that education and professional integrity were pathways out of the violence that surrounded them. Carlos had excelled academically, earning admission to Universidad de Antioquia's medical school, at age 17. Growing up in Medellin during the cartel wars shaped everything about my worldview. Carlos had told me during our conversation after Blake's accident. I saw violence constantly, bombings, assassinations, bodies in streets. But I also saw doctors and nurses risking their lives to treat victims, maintaining professional ethics even when cartels pressured them to prioritize criminals over civilians. Those healthcare workers were my heroes, and I wanted to be like them, using medical skills to help people regardless of circumstances. Carlos's medical training had been completed during Colombia's ongoing conflict, rotating through hospitals that routinely treated gunshot wounds, bomb victims, and casualties from cartel violence. He specialized in orthopedic surgery with focus on spinal trauma, the complex, high-stakes field where millimeters determine whether patients walked again or spent life paralyzed. It required exceptional spatial reasoning, steady hands, ability to make critical decisions under pressure, and years of intensive training that few orthopedic surgeons pursued. By 2010, at age 28, Carlos had completed additional fellowship training in spinal surgery and returned to Medellin to practice at Clínica Las Americas, one of Colombia's premier orthopedic centers. His expertise in complex spinal reconstructions had quickly earned him reputation among Colombia's medical community and beyond professional athletes, including several Colombian Olympic team members specifically requested Carlos for their orthopedic surgeries. I operated on spine fractures from motorcycle accidents, degenerative conditions requiring fusions, sports injuries needing complex repairs, Carlos had explained. By 2015, I'd performed over 800 spinal surgeries with outcomes that matched or exceeded the best spine centers in North America or Europe. I was living my dream, using skills I'd spent my life developing to help people avoid paralysis and return to active lives. But Colombia's ongoing conflicts with drug cartels and criminal organizations had made practicing medicine increasingly dangerous for doctors who maintained ethical boundaries. By 2018, the situation had evolved from Pablo Escobar to more sophisticated criminal networks that infiltrated legitimate institutions, including healthcare systems. The pressure started gradually, Carlos had recalled. First, it was just requests. Wounded cartel members showing up at the hospital needing treatment, sometimes with armed associates demanding priority care. The hospital policy was that we treated everyone regardless of criminal background, which I supported. Medical ethics don't disappear because a patient is a criminal. But then the demands escalated, Carlos had continued, his voice carrying the trauma of those experiences. Cartel associates would demand we not report gunshot wounds to police, which was illegal. They'd insist we discharge their wounded members early, before they were medically stable. They'd pressure us to alter medical records to hide evidence of criminal activity. And worse, they'd sometimes demand we withhold treatment from police officers or soldiers who came in with injuries. The final breaking point had come in early 2019. When Carlos had been working a trauma shift and two patients had arrived simultaneously, a police officer with severe spinal injury from a roadside bomb, and a cartel member with gunshot wounds from the same incident. Both needed immediate surgery, but Carlos only had one surgical team and one operating room available. The choice was medically obvious, Carlos had explained. The police officer had life-threatening spinal trauma that required immediate intervention to prevent paralysis. The cartel member had stable gunshot wounds that could wait several hours without risk. Basic triage, you treat the most urgent case first regardless of who the patient is. But cartel associates in the hospital had different priorities, Carlos had continued. They demanded I operate on their member first, threatened me when I refused, said they'd make me regret choosing a cop over their guy. I told them medical ethics didn't work that way, that I was operating on the patient who would die or become paralyzed without immediate surgery. They left, but not before making clear this wasn't over. Carlos had successfully operated on the police officer, saving him from permanent paralysis. The cartel member had received surgery several hours later from a different surgeon and had also survived. But 3 days later, Carlos had received a message that made continuing in Colombia impossible. Armed men had shown up at his children's school asking questions about his daughters, ages 7 and 9. The implicit threat was unmistakable. Cooperate with cartel demands or watch your family suffer. That's when my wife Maria and I made the decision to leave Colombia, Carlos had told me. We had two options: stay and become cartel collaborators, providing illegal medical services and essentially becoming criminals ourselves, or flee the country and start over somewhere our children would be safe. It wasn't really a choice. We left within 2 weeks. Carlos and Maria had sold everything they owned, withdrew their savings, and entered the United States through the Mexican border in March 2019 with their daughters Sophia and Isabella. They'd applied for asylum based on the documented death threats from criminal organizations. And while that application was processed, a timeline that would eventually stretch to 4 years, Carlos had tried to validate his medical credentials so he could continue practicing orthopedic surgery. What Carlos discovered was that the United States medical licensing system made it nearly impossible for foreign trained physicians to practice, even when their qualifications and experience matched or exceeded American standards. The barriers were particularly insurmountable for physicians fleeing violence without time to gather comprehensive documentation. I needed my medical school transcripts, my surgical residency records, letters from colleagues, documentation of every surgery I'd performed. Carlos had explained, but requesting those records from Colombian institutions would alert cartels to where I'd gone and endangered colleagues who helped me. So I was stuck. I needed documentation to get licensed. But obtaining that documentation could get people killed, even if I'd had all documentation, Carlos had continued. The system requires foreign physicians to repeat residency training, 3 to 7 years of supervised practice despite already having years of experience. I'd performed 800 spinal surgeries, operated on Olympic athletes, taught orthopedic residents in Colombia, but American medical boards said I needed to redo training as if I'd never practiced medicine, starting as a first-year resident in my late 30s. Carlos's asylum application had taken 4 years to process, during which he couldn't legally work and survived on rapidly depleting savings. When he'd finally received work authorization in 2023, he'd been desperate for any income while continuing to study for USM and navigate the impossible licensing requirements. He'd tried applying for healthcare positions that didn't require physician licenses, surgical assistant, medical device rep, clinical research, but even those roles preferred candidates with American credentials. I was running out of money. My family was living in a tiny apartment in Denver, and my daughters needed stability. Carlos had explained. A friend who worked at Vail said they were hiring lift operators for ski season. Decent pay at $1.19 hour. Employee housing available. Flexible schedule so I could study for licensing exams. So Dr. Carlos Mendoza, orthopedic spine surgeon who'd operated on Olympians, became Carlos the lift operator who helped rich tourists onto chairlifts. The psychological toll had been devastating. Carlos would work his lift operator shifts at Vail, then return to employee housing and study surgical journals to maintain his medical knowledge. He practiced spinal immobilization techniques using his daughters as patients in simulation scenarios, keeping his clinical skills sharp even though he couldn't legally use them. He'd watch skiers suffer injuries and want desperately to help, but worried that revealing his medical background would raise questions about why a surgeon was operating lifts. The hardest part wasn't the financial loss or a status decrease, Carlos had told me. Knowing I had expertise in preventing paralysis, that I had spent my career mastering spinal trauma surgery, and I was watching people get inadequate care because American Ski Patrol often lacks advanced orthopedic training. But I couldn't intervene without exposing that I was overqualified for my job, which might prompt questions about my immigration status or why I wasn't licensed. I'd been skiing at Vail for about 4 days when I first noticed the dynamic between Blake Morrison and Carlos Mendoza. Blake was one of those tourists who made ski resorts less pleasant for everyone. Loud, entitled, treating staff like servants who existed solely to facilitate his vacation. He'd been staying at the same lodge as me, and his behavior in the restaurant and common areas had made him notorious among guests and staff alike. Blake's harassment of Carlos had started on day one when he arrived at the lift and Carlos had checked his pass. Blake had made some comment about at least this job doesn't require much English and laughed at his own joke. Carlos had maintained professional courtesy, helping Blake onto the chairlift without reacting to the insult. But Blake had apparently decided Carlos was a good target for ongoing mockery, returning to the same lift every morning to deliver fresh contempt. Hey, buddy, couldn't get a better job than pushing buttons on a ski lift? Blake had said on day 3, the morning I'd witnessed it while standing in lift line. Or is this like the peak of achievement for someone like you? I'm happy to have employment that lets me support my family. Carlos had replied with dignity that Blake clearly didn't recognize or appreciate. Yeah, but what's your actual job in Mexico or wherever you're from? Blake had pressed. Gardener? Dishwasher? Or is lift operator actually a step up for you? I had a professional career in Colombia before coming to the United States. Carlos had responded without elaborating, maintaining the boundary between his personal history and Blake's casual xenophobia. Professional career. Blake had laughed as he'd gotten on the chairlift. Sure, buddy. Keep telling yourself that while you're spending your life loading rich people onto ski lifts. Real successful there. I wanted to say something to tell Blake he was being an asshole, to defend Carlos's dignity, to point out that judging people by their current circumstances revealed more about Blake's character than Carlos's qualifications. But decades of experience had taught me that people like Blake rarely respond well to being called out by strangers. They get defensive, escalate their hostility, and usually take their embarrassment out on the service worker who caused the confrontation. So instead I'd approached Carlos after Blake had gone up the mountain. I apologize for that guy's behavior. He's been rude to everyone all week, but what he said to you was particularly inappropriate. Thank you, Carlos had replied with a slight smile. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. Many tourists assume lift operators are uneducated or couldn't do anything more demanding. They don't consider that people work these jobs for many reasons. Flexible schedules for students, physical outdoor work preferences, or in my case, immigration complications that prevent me from practicing my actual profession, which is... I'd ask, curious about what Carlos was implying. Carlos had hesitated, then apparently decided I seemed trustworthy. I'm an orthopedic spine surgeon. Or one was in Colombia, 18 years of practice including fellowship training in spinal trauma. But I can't get licensed in the US without repeating full residency, which I can't afford after using all my savings to escape cartel violence in Medellin. So I operate ski lifts while I study for licensing exams and hope something changes. That's exactly the kind of waste I've been documenting for years. I'd replied, introducing myself and explaining my background in security consulting and interest in immigrant professional stories. Highly qualified doctors working survival jobs because American licensing systems prioritize protectionism over competence. We talked for several more minutes before other skiers had arrived at the lift, but that conversation had given me context for understanding what happened later that day when Blake's reckless skiing collided with the reality that the stupid lift operator he'd been mocking was literally the most qualified person on the mountain to handle spinal trauma. The accident had occurred around 1 p.m. on an advanced run called Blue Ox, steep, moguls, rated Black Diamond for expert skiers only. Blake had been skiing aggressively all morning, showing off, taking risks that experienced skiers recognized as dangerous given the conditions. By early afternoon, fresh snow combined with warming temperatures had created variable conditions where parts of the run were icy, while others had heavy powder. Blake had been going too fast through a mogul field when he'd caught an edge, gone airborne, and landed badly on his back and neck. Several skiers who'd witnessed the crash had immediately stopped and called ski patrol, recognizing from how Blake had landed and how he was moving that this was a serious injury requiring emergency response. I'd been skiing nearby and had heard the commotion. Skiing over to find Blake lying in the snow, surrounded by concerned skiers. He'd been conscious but in obvious pain, trying to sit up despite several people telling him to stay still. My back, Blake had gasped. Something's wrong with my spine. I can't. It hurts to move and my legs feel weird. Don't move, one skier. A woman who had identified herself as an EMT had instructed, "You might have spinal injury. Moving could make it worse. Ski patrol is on the way." Ski patrol had arrived within about 8 minutes, 2 patrollers with a rescue sled and basic medical equipment. They'd begun assessment while radioing for additional support and potentially helicopter evacuation. But weather had been deteriorating rapidly. What had been light snow that morning had intensified into near whiteout conditions with wind that made helicopter rescue impossible. "We need to get him down the mountain," the lead ski patroller had said after brief assessment. "But I'm concerned about possible spinal fracture. The way he landed and his symptoms, lower back pain, radiating to legs, tingling, weakness, classic signs of lumbar spine injury. We need to immobilize him properly before moving him." The ski patrol had begun attempting to immobilize Blake using their standard equipment and protocols, but I'd noticed they seemed uncertain about exact technique, positioning the backboard, how to secure his neck, whether to use additional stabilization. Their hesitation suggested they didn't have extensive experience with serious spinal trauma, which wasn't surprising. Most ski patrol injuries are broken bones, dislocations, minor head injuries, not catastrophic spinal fractures requiring surgical level immobilization. That's when Carlos had arrived, having skied down from his lift station after hearing the emergency. Radioed traffic and recognizing from the description that this was a serious spinal injury. He'd approached the scene still wearing his lift operator uniform, and Blake, even in his pain and fear, had recognized him. "What's he doing here?" Blake had asked the ski patrollers. "That's just the lift operator. I don't want some random employee gawking at my accident." "Sir, everyone here is trying to help you," one of the patrollers had replied, focused on the immobilization attempt. Carlos had watched the ski patrol's efforts for about 30 seconds before speaking. "Excuse me, I don't mean to interfere, but I have medical training that might be helpful here. That immobilization technique isn't optimal for suspected lumbar spine fracture. May I assist? Are you a doctor?" The lead patroller had asked. "Orthopedic spine surgeon," Carlos had confirmed. 18 years of practice, including specialization in spinal trauma. I've immobilized hundreds of spine fracture patients. What you're doing risks compromising the spinal cord if there's an unstable fracture. Can I show you a better approach? The ski patrollers had looked surprised, but had objected when someone claims spine surgery expertise. During a spinal emergency, you don't argue about their employment status. Blake had looked confused and skeptical, his pain-clouded mind struggling to reconcile lift operator with spine surgeon. "Wait, you're a doctor?" Blake had managed, "But you work the ski lift. How are you a surgeon?" "We can discuss my employment history later," Carlos had replied, already moving to assess Blake, as conditioned with the efficient competence of someone who'd done exactly this hundreds of times. "Right now, I need to make sure we immobilize your spine correctly so we do and turn a stable fracture into spinal cord damage that leaves you paralyzed. Can you feel your toes? Can you wiggle them?" "Barely," Blake had admitted, fear breaking through his earlier skepticism. "It's like they're asleep, and I can feel tingling all down my legs." "Classic signs of spinal cord compression," Carlos had said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable urgency. "We need to get you immobilized and transported immediately. Based on mechanism of injury and your symptoms, you likely have a burst fracture of L1 or L2 your lower thoracic or upper lumbar spine. The fact that you have leg symptoms means there's cord or nerve root compression that could progress to permanent paralysis if we don't handle this perfectly. What do you need from us?" The lead ski patroller had asked, recognizing immediately that Carlos's expertise far exceeded their training. For the next 20 minutes, I'd watched Carlos direct what was essentially a field spine surgery, not the actual surgical repair, but the complex process of assessing, stabilizing, and preparing a potentially catastrophic spinal injury for transport without causing further damage. His technique had been textbook perfect, the kind of precision you only see from someone who's done something thousands of times. "We need to maintain perfect spinal alignment," Carlos had explained while positioning Blake onto the backboard. 1 degree of rotation or flexion could turn a stable fracture into an unstable fracture with complete cord transection. That's the difference between walking again and permanent paralysis. Carlos had supervised every aspect of the immobilization, the exact angle of neck positioning, the specific placement of blocks and straps, the continuous monitoring of Blake's neurological status to catch any deterioration immediately. His hands had moved with practiced confidence. His instructions to the ski patrol specific and authoritative, his medical assessment ongoing throughout the process. Can you still feel your toes? Carlos had asked repeatedly during the immobilization. Yes, Blake had confirmed each time. The fear in his voice suggesting he understood the implications if that answer changed to no. Good, Carlos had said. That means we haven't caused any additional cord damage. If we can get you down this mountain and to a hospital without your neurological status worsening, you'll likely walk again after surgical stabilization. But it's critical that we don't make any mistakes during transport. The descent down the mountain had taken over an hour, with Carlos skiing alongside the rescue sled providing continuous medical monitoring and making adjustments to Blake's positioning as needed. The deteriorating weather had made the rescue increasingly difficult. Visibility was near zero. Wind was creating dangerous conditions, and the ambulance that had been dispatched was stuck on Vale Pass, unable to get through due to the blizzard. We might need to take him all the way to employee housing and wait out the storm, one ski patroller had said. Roads are closed. Medevac can't fly in this, and he needs hospital care we can't provide here. I can monitor him and maintain immobilization until transport is available, Carlos had replied. I've managed spinal trauma in resource-limited settings before. As long as we keep his spine stabilized and watch for neurological deterioration, he can wait several hours if necessary. By the time we'd reached the base of the mountain, the storm had intensified to the point where all roads out of Vale were closed, and helicopter evacuation remained impossible. Blake was brought to the Ski Patrol Medical Facility, essentially a large first aid station, not equipped for serious trauma, where Carlos continued monitoring him while we waited for weather conditions to improve enough for ambulance transport. My legs are getting more numb, Blake had said about 2 hours into waiting, fear evident in his voice. I can barely feel them at all now. That's concerning, Carlos had replied, his expression serious as he performed another neurological assessment. Progressive loss of sensation suggests increasing spinal cord compression. In a hospital, I'd be taking you to surgery immediately to decompress the cord before damage becomes permanent. But we're stuck here until weather clears enough for transport. Is there anything you can do? Blake had asked desperately, all his earlier arrogance replaced by terror about permanent paralysis. Not surgically. I don't have equipment or legal authorization to operate, Carlos had explained. But I can adjust your positioning to potentially reduce cord compression. And I can monitor you closely so we know immediately if your condition deteriorates to the point where we need to take extreme measures to get you transported regardless of weather for the next 3 hours while we'd waited for the storm to clear. Carlos had essentially provided ICU-level spinal care in a first aid station. He'd continuously monitored Blake's neurological status, adjusted positioning to optimize spinal alignment, administered medications from ski patrol supplies to reduce inflammation and manage pain, and maintained the kind of vigilant assessment that prevented Blake's condition from worsening, despite the long delay before hospital transport. Why are you helping me? Blake had asked at one point, his voice small and ashamed. After how I treated you all week, calling you stupid, mocking your job. You could have let regular ski patrol handle this, and I'd probably be paralyzed by now. Why are you saving me? Because I'm a doctor, Carlos had replied simply. I took an oath to help people regardless of who they are or how they treated me. Your behavior was wrong and hurtful, but that doesn't mean you deserve to be paralyzed. Everyone deserves competent medical care, even people who've been unkind. Because I'm a doctor, Carlos had replied simply. I took an oath to help people regardless of who they are or how they treated me. Your behavior was wrong and hurtful, but that doesn't mean you deserve to be paralyzed. Everyone deserves competent medical care, even people who've been unkind. I'm so sorry, Blake had whispered, tears running down his face. I was a complete asshole to you. Every single day this week, making fun of your job, your accent, assuming you were stupid because you work a ski lift. And you literally the most qualified person on this mountain to save me from spending the rest of my life in a wheelchair. Apology accepted, Carlos had said, though his voice carried the weariness of someone who'd received too many apologies that only came after his expertise was proven. But I want you to understand something important. What you said to me this week, that happens constantly to immigrants working service jobs. People see us in uniforms or doing manual labor and make automatic assumptions that we're uneducated, incompetent, probably here illegally. But that lift operator might be a surgeon like me, Carlos had continued, his voice firm but not angry. That janitor might be an engineer. That restaurant worker might be a teacher. We're doing these jobs not because we lack education or skills, but because American credentialing systems don't recognize our qualifications, or because we fled violence in our home countries and lost access to documentation, or because supporting families while navigating impossible licensing requirements takes years. You only recognized my value after your spine broke and you needed my expertise. Carlos had concluded, but my value didn't change between when you were mocking me this morning and when you landed on your back this afternoon. I was the same surgeon with the same expertise. What changed was whether you could see past your assumptions to recognize that expertise existed. Blake had nodded, unable to speak through his tears and shame and the dawning recognition of how his prejudice had nearly cost him the use of his legs. The medical emergency had stripped away all the social status and wealth he'd used to feel superior to people like Carlos, leaving just a terrified man completely dependent on the immigrant he'd spent a week degrading. The storm had finally cleared enough around 6 p.m. for ambulances to reach Vail. Blake had been transported to Vail Health Hospital, where imaging had confirmed Carlos' diagnosis, burst fracture of L2, vertebra with spinal canal compromise and nerve root compression. He'd required emergency surgery to decompress the spinal cord and stabilize the fracture, a complex procedure performed by the hospital's orthopedic surgeon who'd been impressed by Carlos's field management. Whoever immobilized this patient did exceptional work. The surgeon had told me later when I checked on Blake's condition. The fracture was unstable, and any significant movement during the rescue could have caused complete spinal cord transection. Instead, the patient arrived with intact neurological function because someone knew exactly how to handle spinal trauma in the field. That's the difference between walking out of here in 6 weeks versus permanent paralysis. The person who immobilized him is an orthopedic spine surgeon from Colombia, I'd explained. Dr. Carlos Mendoza, 18 years of experience, including operating on Olympic athletes. But he works as a ski lift operator because he can't get licensed in the US. The surgeon's expression had shifted from impressed to troubled. A spine surgeon with that level of expertise is operating ski lifts? That's insane. We have a massive shortage of orthopedic surgeons, particularly spine specialists. Why can't he get licensed? Because he fled Colombia after drug cartels threatened his family when he refused to provide illegal medical services. I replied, he lost access to comprehensive documentation, and even if he had it, the system requires foreign physicians to redo residency, regardless of experience. So, one of Latin America's top spine surgeons works minimum wage at a ski resort, while Americans suffer from lack of access to orthopedic care. The surgeon had shaken his head in frustration. That's exactly the kind of licensing barrier that makes no sense. If Carlos can immobilize a complex spinal fracture better than most American orthopedic surgeons, clearly his training and experience are equivalent to or better than US standards. Making him repeat residency is just protectionism that hurts patients. Blake had spent 4 days in Vail Health Hospital before being stable enough for transport back to Canada. During that time, he'd requested multiple times to speak with Carlos, eventually convincing the hospital to contact him. Their conversation had happened in Blake's hospital room with me present, Carlos having agreed to visit after finishing his lift operator shift. Dr. Mendoza, Blake had begun, his voice still weak but carrying genuine emotion. I don't even know how to begin apologizing for my behavior. For a week, I treated you with contempt based on nothing except my own prejudice and ignorance. I assumed you were stupid because you work a ski lift, that you were probably illegal, that you couldn't possibly have education or expertise. And then I broke my spine, and you saved me from spending the rest of my life paralyzed. Blake had continued, starting to cry. The doctors here told me that your immobilization technique was perfect, that if Ski Patrol had handled it alone, I'd probably be in a wheelchair forever. You saved my life, my mobility, my future, everything, despite me spending days mocking you as stupid. I've already accepted your apology, Carlos had replied gently. And I'm glad you're going to recover and walk again. That's what matters to me as a physician. Patient outcomes, not whether they were kind to me beforehand. But I need you to know I've learned something profound from this, Blake had insisted. About assumptions, about prejudice, about how I view immigrants and service workers. I spent my life believing that people's jobs reflected their intelligence and capabilities. That wealthy professionals like me were automatically superior to people working manual labor or service positions. This experience has shown me how dangerously wrong those assumptions were. Blake had continued. The stupid lift operator I mocked turns out to be more educated and skilled than almost anyone I know. And that just made me question every other assumption I made of people based on their current circumstances rather than actually knowing who they are. I'm planning to do something meaningful with that lesson, Blake had added. I work in commercial real estate development in Vancouver. I have connections with hospital administrators, medical licensing boards, politicians who influence healthcare policy. I want to use those connections to advocate for reforming the barriers that keep qualified foreign physicians like you from practicing. That would be meaningful. Carlos had acknowledged there are thousands of foreign-trained doctors in North America working survival jobs. Because licensing systems assume our training is automatically inferior regardless of actual competence or outcomes. If your near paralysis motivates reforms that help other refugee physicians practice medicine, that creates something positive from a traumatic experience. Over the following months, Blake had been surprisingly committed to that advocacy work. He'd written op-eds about his experience that had appeared in Canadian and American publications. He'd connected Carlos with immigration attorneys who specialized in medical licensing issues. He'd made introductions to Colorado medical board members and hospital administrators interested in creating pathways for internationally trained physicians. Wealthy Canadian saved from paralysis by Colombian surgeon working as ski lift operator had generated significant attention, sparking broader conversations about medical licensing barriers and the waste of physician expertise. The dramatic nature of Blake's rescue combined with Carlos' compelling backstory. Olympic surgeon fled cartel threats. Now, operating ski lifts had created exactly the kind of narrative that forced people to pay attention to systematic problems they'd previously ignored. Dr. Carlos Mendoza represents thousands of highly qualified foreign physicians in the United States and Canada who can't practice medicine because our licensing systems prioritize protectionism over competence, one editorial had noted. We complain about physician shortages while making it impossible for experienced doctors to practice. The irony of a spine surgeon operating ski lifts while patients suffer from lack of orthopedic access should shame us into reform. The publicity had attracted attention from medical licensing reform organizations, immigrant rights advocates, and even some state legislators interested in creating expedited pathways for refugee physicians. Carlos's case had several elements that made it particularly compelling. Dramatic rescue, undeniable expertise, sympathetic backstory fleeing violence, and clear demonstration that licensing barriers were harming patients. The Carlos Mendoza case shows everything wrong with our current system. Dr. Patricia Valdez, an immigrant physician advocate, had testified during a Colorado legislative hearing. We have an experienced orthopedic surgeon operating ski lifts because medical boards will unrecognize his Colombian training. Then a tourist breaks his spine on the mountain, and Carlos's expertise is the only thing preventing permanent paralysis. That contradiction should force us to examine whether our licensing barriers actually protect quality or just protect American physicians from competition. Colorado had eventually become one of the first states to pass legislation, creating streamlined licensing pathways for refugee physicians who fled persecution or violence. The bill had established processes for doctors to demonstrate competence through supervised practice and exams, rather than repeating full residencies, particularly for physicians with extensive experience like Carlos. What we're recognizing, the bill's sponsor had explained, is that a surgeon who has performed hundreds of spinal operations and can perfectly immobilize a complex fracture in blizzard conditions on a ski slope is clearly competent to practice in Colorado. Making him repeat 7 years of residency training despite 18 years of experience isn't quality assurance. It's a bureaucratic barrier that wastes expertise and hurts patients. Carlos had been among the first refugee physicians to benefit from Colorado's reformed licensing process. Within 8 months of the law's passage, he'd completed supervised clinical practice, demonstrated his surgical skills to evaluating orthopedic surgeons, and received his Colorado medical license 12 years after he'd fled Colombia, and 4 years after he'd started working at Vail. I cried when I got the license, Carlos had told me during a phone call after the approval came through. Not just because I could finally practice medicine again, but because it validated that the choice to flee Colombia rather than become a cartel collaborator was right. For years, I questioned whether upholding medical ethics was worth losing my career and forcing my family into poverty. Getting licensed felt like affirmation that integrity matters even when the cost is devastating. Carlos had been hired by a hospital in Denver specializing in spinal surgery, bringing his 18-plus years of experience to treating patients with complex spinal conditions. His clinical outcomes had been exceptional. His surgical technique had impressed colleagues, and his ability to handle high-pressure spinal emergencies had made him invaluable to the trauma department. Dr. Mendoza is extraordinary. His department chief had commented during a performance review. His experience base is incredible, hundreds of spine surgeries, including many complex cases we rarely see in the U.S. His decision-making under pressure is flawless, and his patient outcomes are among the best in our system. We're fortunate Colorado reformed its licensing laws because Carlos is exactly the kind of physician we desperately need. That assessment had validated what Carlos had always known, that his Colombian training and experience had made him a highly skilled spine surgeon whose capabilities matched or exceeded American standards. The years he'd spent operating ski lifts hadn't been because he lacked competence. They'd been because systematic barriers assumed foreign training was automatically inferior, and because refugee circumstances had made navigating those barriers even more impossible. Blake had continued his advocacy work and had developed what appeared to be genuine friendship with Carlos, their relationship evolving from patient rescuer to colleagues working toward the same reform goals. Blake had funded medical mission trips where Carlos could perform spinal surgeries in resource-limited settings, using his platform to highlight both Carlos's expertise and broader issues affecting refugee physicians. I think about that day on the mountain constantly. Blake had told me during a conversation 2 years after the accident. Not just the terror of being paralyzed, though that was awful, but the realization of how close my own prejudice came to preventing my rescue. If Carlos had decided that after a week of my abuse he wasn't going to help when I needed him, I'd be in a wheelchair and it would be my fault for driving away the one person who could save me. That near miss fundamentally changed how I see immigrants and service workers, Blake had continued. I used to make automatic assumptions about people based on their jobs and their accents. If someone was operating a ski lift or cleaning offices, I unconsciously classified them as less educated or capable than professionals like me. Now, I recognize that assumption is both morally wrong and pragmatically stupid. The person operating the lift might be a surgeon, Blake had concluded. The janitor might be an engineer. The Uber driver might be a lawyer. Current job tells you nothing about actual qualifications or the circumstances that force someone into survival work. Carlos taught me that lesson in the most dramatic way possible. And I'm trying to make sure other people learn it without needing to break their spines first. 3 years after the accident, Carlos had performed over 200 spinal surgeries in Colorado, saved dozens of patients from paralysis, and trained resident physicians in advanced spine techniques. He'd also become a prominent voice advocating for medical licensing reform, speaking at conferences about his experience and pushing for recognition of foreign medical training. There are thousands of refugee and immigrant physicians in North America working as medical assistants. Uber drivers, janitors, jobs that don't require medical licenses because we couldn't get credentialed despite having expertise that could address physician shortages. Carlos had explained during congressional testimony about healthcare workforce issues. We're not asking for special treatment or shortcuts. We're asking for competency-based assessment rather than automatic rejection based on where we trained. The argument that we need to repeat training to ensure quality doesn't survive scrutiny, Carlos had continued. I proved my competence by immobilizing a complex spinal fracture in field conditions, by passing the same exams as American orthopedic surgeons, by demonstrating surgical skills through supervised practice. That's legitimate quality assurance. But requiring me to repeat 18 years of training I'd already completed, that's not quality protection. It's protectionism that hurts patients. The testimony had been part of broader advocacy efforts generating momentum for physician licensing reform at both state and federal levels. Several additional states beyond Colorado had passed similar streamlined licensing pathways for refugee and immigrant physicians. Medical organizations were exploring more flexible approaches to assessing foreign credentials, and hospitals facing severe physician shortages were pushing for reforms that would let them hire qualified refugee doctors. Now, before I wrap up Carlos's story and finish this beer here at the ski lodge bar, let me pause for a quick word. If you're getting value from this story, about an Olympic spine surgeon forced to operate ski lifts while navigating refugee trauma and licensing barriers, do Uncle Sam a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories about highly qualified immigrant professionals working survival jobs, while facing contempt from entitled people who have no idea who they actually dismissing. And drop a comment telling me if you've witnessed similar situations, refugee professionals you've met, qualified immigrants doing work beneath their expertise, or times when someone's hidden credentials emerged during emergencies. These stories matter, and your engagement helps them reach people who need to understand the human cost of protectionist licensing systems. Carlos's story has become a powerful advocacy tool precisely because it contains every element needed to force attention to systematic problems. A sympathetic protagonist fleeing cartel violence, undeniable expertise demonstrated through dramatic rescue, a reformed villain who learned from his prejudice, clear policy solutions, and most importantly, a demonstration that licensing barriers don't just harm immigrant physicians. They harm patients who need access to specialized care. The Mendoza case opened doors that advocacy organizations had been pounding on for decades, Dr. Valdez had told me. Suddenly, legislators and medical board members who'd ignored reform proposals for years were willing to listen, because Carlos had proven so dramatically that refugee physicians could provide life-saving care that American systems couldn't match. Sometimes individual stories break through where policy arguments don't. But Dr. Valdez had also noted the limitations of relying on dramatic rescues to drive reform. For every Carlos who got his moment of vindication when Blake broke his spine, there are hundreds of refugee physicians whose expertise never gets recognized because they don't happen to be present when someone needs their specific skills. They just quietly work survival jobs until they give up on licensing or age out of their medical knowledge. Those physicians matter too, even without dramatic rescue stories. That observation had resonated with me, and I reflected on Carlos' journey over the 3 years since Blake's accident. The rescue had been dramatic and generated publicity that helped Carlos personally and contributed to licensing reform. But it also highlighted how many other refugee and immigrant physicians were still operating, ski lifts, or driving Ubers or cleaning offices, while their expertise went to waste because they hadn't gotten lucky enough to be present during an emergency that validated their credentials. As I finished my beer and prepared to head back to my hotel room, I thought about how to frame Carlos's story in a way that honored both his individual triumph and the thousands of others still waiting for systems to recognize their expertise without requiring them to perform miracle rescues first. You know what stays with me from that whole experience? My lodge neighbor Tom had said when I'd finished recounting the story. Tom was a retired teacher from Michigan who I'd been sharing meals with all week. Not just that Carlos saved Blake's spine, though that's incredible, but Carlos' explanation for why he helped despite being treated terribly, because I am a doctor and I took an oath. That kind of integrity, maintaining professional ethics, even when it costs you personally, that's real character. Exactly, I'd agreed. Carlos could have let regular ski patrol handle it, and Blake would probably be paralyzed. He could have revealed his expertise, but provided minimal help as payback for a week of mockery. Instead, he gave Blake the same expert care he'd have given anyone. Because his medical ethics didn't disappear just because a patient was cruel to him. That's the immigrant story Americans need to understand, Tom had continued. People like Carlos didn't come here because they couldn't succeed in their home countries. They came because staying meant death or compromising their values in ways they couldn't accept. Carlos chose poverty and professional erasure over becoming a cartel doctor. That takes more courage than most of us will ever need to demonstrate. And yet, Tom had added, we treat refugees like they're threats or burdens instead of recognizing the expertise and integrity they bring. Carlos spent 12 years being told his training wasn't good enough, being mocked as stupid by tourists like Blake, working minimum wage despite being one of Latin America's top spine surgeons. That is not just waste. It's cruelty to people who've already sacrificed everything to maintain their principles. Tom's observation had captured exactly what made Carlos's story both inspiring and infuriating. Inspiring because it showed that individual refugees could overcome impossible obstacles through persistence and eventually practice their professions again. Infuriating because it revealed how unnecessarily difficult American systems made that process. How much expertise was wasted during years-long licensing battles. And how many refugee professionals never made it through it all. Well, bro, our evening here at the lodge bar is wrapping up, and I should probably head to my room before the night skiing crowd shows up and it's too rowdy. But tomorrow, if we run into each other on the slopes or at breakfast, remind me to tell you about a situation I witnessed in Vegas, where a bartender everyone assumed was just mixing drinks turned out to be a trauma nurse from the Philippines, who stopped a guy from bleeding out when he cut his arm on broken glass. You're going to love it because it follows similar patterns. Entitled customers dismissing service workers, medical emergency, hidden expertise revealed, and people forced to confront their assumptions. It'll be a real pleasure if we cross paths again tomorrow, Tom. And hey, if you've witnessed or experienced situations like what Carlos went through, drop a comment on Uncle Sam's video and share your story. Tell people what city and country you're from. Talk about refugee professionals you've met or licensing barriers you've navigated yourself. Because these conversations matter, they remind people they're not alone in facing systematic obstacles. And they educate viewers who've never thought about the highly qualified professionals who might be serving their food, operating their ski lifts, or driving their taxis. So, what do you think about medical licensing barriers and how we treat refugee physicians fleeing violence? Have you met foreign-trained doctors working non-medical jobs because their credentials aren't recognized? Have you seen situations where someone's hidden expertise emerged during emergencies, forcing recognition that should have existed all along? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And special thank you to Miguel Torres from Aspen, Colorado, and Rachel Kim from Toronto, Canada, who've been engaging with our previous videos. Miguel, your comment about your brother who was an engineer in Venezuela but works construction here really connected with people. Rachel, appreciate you sharing how your family doctor in Korea ended up working as a translator in Canada. Keep those stories coming because they matter and they help people understand the reality behind statistics about immigrant underemployment. The lesson from Carlos S. story remains crystal clear. Expertise doesn't disappear because licensing boards don't recognize it. Human courage isn't measured by current job titles, and assumptions about people based on their work uniforms can be dangerously wrong. Dr. Carlos Mendoza was an exceptional spine surgeon, whether he was operating on Olympic athletes in Colombia or operating ski lifts in Colorado. The only thing that changed was whether systems and people recognized that expertise and allowed him to use it. Because at the end of the day, America and Canada have a choice. We can continue maintaining protectionist licensing barriers that keep refugee physicians working minimum wage while patients die from lack of specialist access. We can judge immigrants by their survival jobs rather than recognizing the courage and expertise they bring despite impossible circumstances. We can mock service workers without knowing whether they surgeons or engineers forced into those roles by systematic barriers. Or we can reform these systems to actually assess competence, recognize the sacrifices refugees make to maintain integrity, and utilize the tremendous medical expertise that people like Carlos offer despite having lost everything to escape violence. Carlos eventually got through after 12 years of fighting, 12 years during which his expertise was wasted. Patients who could have benefited from his care didn't get access to specialized spine surgery. And America's orthopedic shortage worsened while an Olympic surgeon operated ski lifts. That waste should outrage us into demanding reform rather than just celebrating that one individual persisted through an impossible system. Because for every Carlos Mendoza who makes it through eventually, there are hundreds who give up, who can't afford the years without medical income that licensing requires, who age out of their surgical skills during decade-long battles, or who simply accept that North America will never recognize their expertise and stop trying. Those are the surgeons who stay driving Ubers, the trauma nurses who keep mixing drinks, the physicians whose expertise dies with them because protectionist systems valued limiting competition over serving patients and honoring the sacrifices refugees made to maintain their ethical principles. Anyway, bro, it's definitely time for this old man to head to his room and get some rest before tomorrow is skiing. But I hope Carlos' story resonates with you the way it did with me. As a reminder that the people we dismiss might be the only ones who can save us when we need help most, that refugees often bring more expertise and integrity than we'll ever develop ourselves. And that treating everyone with respect isn't just morally right, but pragmatically essential, because you never know when you might need the skills of the person you've been mocking. Thanks for listening to Uncle Sam's story about Carlos and Blake in the Colorado mountain where one entitled tourist learned the hardest possible way, that the people you judge by their uniforms might be more educated, more skilled, and more courageous than you'll ever be. Stay humble out there. Treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their current circumstances. And remember that assumptions about refugees and immigrants based on their survival jobs are almost always wrong, and sometimes catastrophically so. Until next time, bro.